When Mark's parents left for a weekend getaway, he was thrilled to have the house to himself. At 18, he relished the freedom and planned a quiet weekend of video games and movies. Their suburban home was in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by familiar neighbors, who always looked out for each other. On Friday evening, after a quick dinner, Mark settled in the living room with his favorite horror movie. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the wind outside. As the movie reached its climax, he thought he heard a soft knock on the front door. He paused the movie, straining to listen. The knock came again, a gentle tap, tap, tap that sent a chill down his spine. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. He opened the door, just a crack, and looked around. The front yard was empty, the street deserted. Shrugging it off as his imagination, Mark returned to the couch. But as he sat down, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Unknown. "Can I come in?" Mark's heart skipped a beat. He looked around the empty living room, feeling a sudden surge of unease. He typed a reply, his fingers trembling. "Mark. Who is this?" A few moments later, his phone buzzed again. Unknown. "I'm already here." Fear gripped him. He checked the locks on all the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. He tried to convince himself it was just a prank, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. He decided to call his best friend, Jake, for some reassurance. "Hey, man, someone's messing with me," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I keep getting creepy texts." "Are you sure it's not just a prank?" Jake replied. "Maybe someone from school?" "Maybe, but it doesn't feel right. The text said they're already here." "That's freaky. Want me to come over?" "Yeah, that'd be great." Jake promised to be there in 15 minutes. Mark hung up, feeling a bit better knowing help was on the way. He double-checked the locks again and returned to the living room, trying to distract himself with a movie. But just as he was starting to relax, his phone buzzed again. Unknown. "I see you." Mark's blood ran cold. He looked around the room, every shadow suddenly sinister. He grabbed a kitchen knife and held it tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. The minutes ticked by slowly as he waited for Jake to arrive. Finally, the doorbell rang. Mark rushed to the door and opened it, relief flooding through him when he saw Jake standing there. "Thank God you're here," Mark said, pulling his friend inside. Jake looked concerned. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just these texts, they're freaking me out." "Let's see them." Mark showed Jake the messages. Jake frowned, then looked around the house. "Maybe we should check the place, make sure no one's actually here." They went room by room, checking closets, under beds, and even the basement. Everything seemed normal. They returned to the living room, feeling slightly more at ease. "Probably just some jerk messing with you," Jake said, trying to lighten the mood. "Want to watch the rest of the movie?" Mark nodded, grateful for the company. They settled on the couch, but before they could start the movie, Mark's phone buzzed again. Unknown. "Nice friend, but he can't help you." Mark showed the message to Jake, who now looked genuinely worried. "Okay, this is getting too weird. Maybe we should call the police." Before they could make the call, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. Mark's heart raced as he fumbled for the flashlight on his phone. The beam of light cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice tense. They headed for the front door, but just as they reached it, they heard a slow, deliberate knock. Mark's hand froze on the doorknob. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice shaking. The knocking stopped. The silence was deafening. Then a voice, low and whispering, came from the other side of the door. "Let me in, Mark." Panic surged through him. He and Jake backed away from the door, retreating to the kitchen. Mark's phone buzzed again. Unknown. You can't run. They locked the kitchen door and grabbed the largest knives they could find. The house felt like a trap, every corner hiding potential danger. They could hear footsteps now, slow and measured, moving through the house. What do we do? Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. Jake's eyes were wide with fear. We have to get out, find a way to the neighbors. They edged toward the back door, but just as they reached it, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Going somewhere? The figure whispered. Mark and Jake screamed, but their voices seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. They charged at the figure with their knives, but it moved with unnatural speed, dodging their attacks effortlessly. Your fear is delicious, it hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. In a desperate bid, Mark grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him toward the basement stairs. They tumbled down, landing in a heap at the bottom. Mark's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams around the room. They could hear the figure descending the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. There was no escape. The basement was a dead end. Any last words? The figure taunted, its voice echoing off the walls. Mark and Jake huddled together, their knives clutched tightly. They were trapped, with no way out. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a face twisted with malice and hunger. Mark's phone buzzed one last time. Unknown. Game over. The figure lunged at them, and the basement was plunged into chaos. Their screams echoed through the house, then were abruptly silenced. When the police arrived the next morning, they found the house empty, the basement door ajar. There was no sign of Mark or Jake, only their phones lying on the floor, displaying the final, chilling message. The house was sealed off, labeled as another unsolved mystery. The neighbors whispered about the strange events, but no one dared to enter, and every so often on a quiet night the new tenants would hear a faint, eerie whisper, "Let me in." Julia had just moved into her new house. The quaint two-story home was an old Victorian with creaky floorboards and an undeniable charm. It was her dream house, a place she could finally call her own after years of saving and hard work. There was just one thing that bothered her: the basement. The real estate agent had mentioned it only briefly, saying it was just used for storage and needed a bit of cleaning. Julia hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now, standing at the top of the basement stairs, she felt an inexplicable sense of dread. Armed with a flashlight and a broom, she decided to tackle the basement on a quiet Saturday afternoon. The wooden steps creaked loudly under her weight as she descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, she found herself in a large, dusty room filled with old furniture covered in white sheets and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. She started cleaning, sweeping away the dust and uncovering the furniture. As she worked, she noticed a small door in the far corner of the basement. It was oddly out of place, almost as if it had been hidden on purpose. Curiosity got the better of her, and she approached the door, brushing away the cobwebs that clung to its surface. The door was locked, but a rusty key lay on a nearby shelf. She picked it up, hands trembling slightly, and inserted it into the lock. With a click, the door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. Taking a deep breath, Julia shone her flashlight into the passage. It led to a smaller room at the end, barely illuminated by the weak beam of her flashlight. She stepped inside, feeling a chill run down her spine. The room was empty, except for an old wooden chest in the center. The chest was intricately carved with strange symbols Julia didn't recognize. She hesitated, but her curiosity was too strong. She knelt down and opened the chest. Inside, she found a collection of old photographs, letters, and a dusty journal. As she flipped through the photographs, she saw images of a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl. They seemed happy, but something about their eyes seemed off, almost lifeless. She put the photos aside and picked up one of the letters. It was dated 1923 and addressed to a Mr. William Harper. Dear Mr. Harper, the incident with your daughter has deeply troubled us. We believe that the basement holds a dark presence, and it is best to leave it undisturbed. Please do not venture into the hidden room. Sincerely, Dr. Samuel Gray. Julia's heart pounded in her chest. She quickly grabbed the journal and began to read. It detailed the life of the Harper family, but as she read on, the entries became more disturbing. Mr. Harper wrote about his daughter, Emily, who had started acting strangely after playing in the basement. She would speak in a language they couldn't understand and often had violent outbursts. The last entry sent chills down Julia's spine. December 12th, 1923. Emily is gone. The darkness took her. We should have listened to Dr. Gray. The basement is cursed, and now our little girl is lost forever. A loud crash echoed from the main basement room, jolting Julia back to reality. She quickly put the journal back in the chest and stood up, her flashlight beam shaking as she turned towards the noise. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She cautiously walked back to the main room, scanning for the source of the noise. One of the old mirrors had fallen off the wall and shattered on the floor. But that wasn't what scared her the most. In the reflection of the broken glass, she saw the faint outline of a little girl standing behind her. Julia spun around, but there was no one there. Her heart raced as she backed up, nearly tripping over the broken glass. She had to get out of the basement. As she reached the stairs, she felt a cold hand grasp her ankle. She screamed and kicked, breaking free and scrambling up the steps. She slammed the basement door shut and locked it, leaning against it as she tried to catch her breath. The house was silent, but she could feel a presence watching her. That night, Julia couldn't sleep. She kept hearing whispers and footsteps coming from the basement. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but the fear was too real. The next morning, she called a paranormal investigator. When he arrived, he listened to her story and agreed to check the basement. After hours of investigation, he emerged, looking pale and shaken. "This house has a dark history," he said. "The spirit of Emily Harper is still here, trapped and angry. The basement was used for occult practices by her father, trying to bring her back after she disappeared. You need to leave this house." Julia didn't need to be told twice. She packed her things and left that very day, vowing never to return. The house remained empty and the basement door stayed locked, hiding the secrets and the darkness that lingered within. As Julia drove away, she glanced back one last time and saw a little girl standing at the window, watching her leave. She quickly looked away, focusing on the road ahead, determined to leave the past behind. But the memories of the basement haunted her dreams, a constant reminder of the forgotten horror that lurked in the shadows of her once beloved home. Sarah always enjoyed the solitude of her suburban home. The cozy two-story house, nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, was her sanctuary. With her parents out of town for the weekend, she relished the opportunity to have the place to herself. At 17, she was responsible and had proven many times she could handle being alone. It was a chilly Friday evening in late autumn. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, and a crisp wind rattled the trees. Sarah made herself some hot chocolate wrapped in a warm blanket and settled on the couch to watch a movie. As she sipped her drink and lost herself in the plot, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from her neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins. "Mrs. Jenkins. Hi, Sarah. Just wanted to let you know we'll be out of town tonight. If you need anything, call the police or the Johnsons down the street. Stay safe." Sarah smiled at the message, appreciating the neighborly concern. She replied with a quick thank you and returned to her movie. An hour later, as the credits rolled, she noticed how quiet the house was. Too quiet. She shrugged off the unease, telling herself it was just because she was alone. She decided to take a quick shower before bed. In the bathroom, as she washed her hair, she heard a faint sound. It was like a soft tapping. She paused, listening carefully. Nothing. Must be the wind, she thought, and continued rinsing off. After her shower, she dressed in her favorite pajamas and went downstairs to make sure the doors were locked. As she checked the back door, she heard the tapping again. This time, it was clearer, like someone knocking on a window. Her heart began to race. She tiptoed to the living room window and peeked through the curtains. Nothing. Just as she let out a sigh of relief, her phone buzzed again. She picked it up, expecting another text from Mrs. Jenkins or her parents, but it was from an unknown number. Unknown. I'm watching you. Her blood ran cold. She looked around, trying to convince herself it was just a prank. But the tapping started again, louder this time, coming from the kitchen. She slowly walked to the kitchen, her hands trembling. The window above the sink faced the backyard, and she could see a dark figure standing just outside. Panic surged through her. She grabbed a knife from the counter, her hands shaking. The figure remained motionless, staring at her. She couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette. She mustered the courage to shout, "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand and knocked on the window, 3 slow, deliberate taps. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She backed away, keeping the knife in front of her. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown. Let me in. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She ran to the front door, intending to escape to the Johnsons' house. But as she reached for the doorknob, a shadow passed by the window beside the door. She froze, realizing there might be more than one person outside. Desperate, she retreated to the living room and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice asked. There's someone outside my house, Sarah whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. They're watching me and knocking on the windows. Stay on the line, ma'am. Officers are on their way. Can you see them right now? Sarah peeked through the living room curtains again. The figure was no longer at the kitchen window. She scanned the yard, but saw no one. I don't see them anymore, but they were there. Please hurry. Minutes felt like hours as she waited for the police. She kept glancing at her phone, praying for a response. Then, another text from the unknown number. Unknown. Almost there. Just as she was about to break down, flashing lights filled her driveway. 2 police officers approached the house, and Sarah ran to the door to let them in. Are you all right, miss? One of the officers asked. I think so, Sarah stammered. There was someone outside watching me and knocking on the windows. The officers did a thorough check of the property. They found no one, but they did find footprints in the mud outside the kitchen window. They assured Sarah they would patrol the neighborhood throughout the night and advised her to keep all doors and windows locked. Shaken, but relieved the police were taking her seriously, Sarah thanked them and locked up the house once more. She went upstairs to her bedroom, clutching her phone tightly. Just as she was about to settle into bed, her phone buzzed one last time. Unknown. Sweet dreams. Sarah's heart raced as she stared at the message. She checked the time. 3 a.m. The fear and exhaustion finally caught up with her, and she lay down, pulling the covers over her head. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of her parents arriving home. She ran to them, explaining everything that had happened. They were alarmed and immediately called the police to follow up. Over the next few days, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She double-checked locks, avoided going out alone, and always kept her phone close. The texts never came again, and the police never found the person who had terrorized her that night. But every time she heard a faint tapping, she couldn't help but feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, wondering if the visitor would return.